my son Leo watched coldly as my wife Sarah threw my grease-stained coveralls onto the wet driveway, telling me that 30 years of my sweat meant absolutely nothing to this family anymore. I stood there with a failing kidney and exactly $42 in my wallet, looking at the two-story colonial house in Oak Creek that I had paid off 3 years ahead of schedule. They thought they were finally rid of the old mechanic who outlived his usefulness, but they had no idea that a certified letter was currently heading toward that front door to change everything. My name is Thomas Miller. I'm 61 years old, and for 3 decades, I've lived in the blue-collar suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, working 12-hour shifts to provide a life I never had. I spent 35 years as a master mechanic at Miller's Auto Body, turning wrenches until my knuckles bled and my back felt like it was made of rusted iron and broken glass shards. I always believed that hard work and total honesty were the only currencies that mattered, never realizing that the people sleeping under my own roof were trading in a much darker kind of deception. I met Sarah when I was 25, a young man with nothing but a toolbox and a dream of building a legacy for a family that would actually love and respect me. When Leo was born, I promised him that he would never know the hunger or the cold that I experienced growing up in a series of foster homes across the rougher parts of Ohio. I took a second job, working security at the freight yards from midnight until dawn, just so Sarah could have the designer kitchen and the manicured lawn she always said she deserved. Leo grew up with the best tutors, the newest computers, and a college fund that I meticulously built, dollar by dollar, while I skipped lunches and wore the same boots for 5 years straight. Every time my body screamed in pain from the heavy lifting at the shop, I would look at the framed photo of my son in his graduation gown and find the strength to continue. Sarah always handled the paperwork and the finances, claiming she wanted to save me the stress after my long days, and I trusted her blindly because I thought our marriage was a partnership. She insisted the new house in Oak Creek be put in her name for tax purposes and legal protection for our future, a detail I never questioned because I loved her completely. As the years passed, I noticed a growing distance in Leo's eyes, an entitlement that I mistook for the confidence of a young man who had been given every possible advantage in life. He started looking at my grease-stained hands with a subtle disgust, as if the very labor that paid for his Ivy League tuition was a source of deep embarrassment for his social circle. I laughed it off, telling myself that I worked this hard so he wouldn't have to, never imagining that his lack of respect was actually rooted in a secret Sarah had kept hidden. 6 months ago, my younger brother David went into total renal failure, and without a donor, the doctor said he wouldn't make it through the winter without a miracle or a perfect match. I didn't hesitate for a single second to volunteer for the testing, believing that our shared blood would make me the perfect candidate to save my only brother from a very slow death. The doctors at the University Medical Center ran a battery of tests, including a detailed genetic screening to ensure there would be no complications or unforeseen issues during the transplant surgery process. I sat in that sterile white office, expecting to hear about surgery dates, but instead, the doctor looked at me with a confused expression that made my stomach drop into my very boots. He told me that while I wasn't a match for David, there was a glaring anomaly in my genetic profile regarding my registered son, Leo, that simply did not make any biological sense. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird as he explained, in very clear clinical terms, that there was a 0% chance that I was Leo's biological father at all. I walked out of that hospital in a daze, the world blurring around me as 30 years of memories suddenly felt like a movie I had watched but never actually lived in reality. I drove home in silence, the steering wheel of my old Ford truck feeling cold and foreign in my hands as I replayed every moment of Leo's childhood, looking for the hidden lies. When I walked into our pristine living room, Sarah was sipping wine and looking at a brochure for a Mediterranean cruise she wanted me to pay for as an anniversary gift this year. I laid the medical report on the marble coffee table, my voice trembling as I asked her to explain why our son's DNA didn't contain a single trace of my own genetic heritage. Her face didn't crumble in shame. Instead, it hardened into a mask of pure coldness that I had never seen before in all the decades we had spent sleeping in the same bed. She laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that cut through my soul, telling me that I was always too stupid to realize a woman like her would never settle for a common grease monkey. Sarah confessed that she had been seeing an old flame from her college days during the first year of our marriage, and that Leo was the product of that brief, passionate weekend encounter. She admitted that she only stayed with me because I was a reliable paycheck and a fool who was willing to work himself to death to provide her with a comfortable, upper-class lifestyle. I looked at the woman I had cherished for 30 years and saw a complete stranger, a predator who had fed on my labor and my love while laughing at my utter simplicity. Leo walked into the room then, having heard the shouting, and I expected him to be as horrified as I was, but he just stood by his mother with a smirk on his face. My son, the boy I had coached in baseball and stayed up with through every childhood fever, looked at me and said he had known the truth since he was 18 years old. He told me that his real father was a successful corporate attorney in New York and that he was tired of pretending to be proud of a father who smelled like diesel. The betrayal was a physical weight, crushing the air out of my lungs as I realized that both of the people I lived for had been mocking me behind my back for years. I told Sarah to pack her bags and get out of the house I had built, but she just smiled and reminded me that my name wasn't on a single piece of legal paperwork. She pulled out the deed to the Oak Creek house, showing me her name alone, and then she handed me a pre-written eviction notice that her lawyer friend had helped her prepare months ago. Leo stepped forward, his eyes full of a strange, dark triumph, and told me that if I wasn't out of their house by sunset, he would call the police and report a trespasser. I realized then that they had planned this for a long time, waiting for the right moment to discard me like a worn-out engine part that was no longer worth the cost of maintenance. I spent the next 3 hours throwing my few belongings into garbage bags, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely zip up the worn leather duffel bag I'd used since the army. As I carried my toolbox out to the driveway, Sarah stood on the porch with a glass of expensive Chardonnay, watching me struggle with the heavy weight of my only remaining earthly possessions. She didn't offer a single word of apology, only a warning that if I tried to contact her or Leo again, she would take out a restraining order to protect their new life. I drove away from the home I had bled for, watching the oak trees I had planted with my own hands disappear in the rearview mirror as the sun began to set over Pittsburgh. I had exactly $42.50 tank of gas, with nowhere to go and no one to turn to, because I had spent 30 years focusing entirely on a family that never existed. I pulled my truck into the gravel lot of the film studio, where I used to pick up extra mechanic shifts, parking in the shadows behind a row of rusted equipment trailers. The metal floor of the truck bed was cold and hard against my aching back, but the pain in my chest was so much worse that I barely noticed the winter air biting. I lay there, staring at the stars, wondering how a man could work so hard for so long and end up with nothing but a toolbox and a heart full of shattered glass fragments. Sleep wouldn't come, only the haunting images of Leo's first steps and the way Sarah used to smile at me before the lies became the only thing holding our broken house together. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent in the freezing rain fixing cars, all to buy Sarah that designer kitchen where she was now likely laughing at my sudden total ruin. By 4 a.m, the cold had seeped into my bones, and my failing kidney began to throb with a dull, persistent ache that reminded me my time was running out fast. I sat up and gripped the steering wheel, trying to find a reason to keep breathing when everything I had built had been stolen by the very people I had sworn to protect. Just as the gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, a sleek black sedan pulled into the gravel lot, its headlights cutting through the morning mist like twin spotlights. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped out, looking completely out of place in the industrial wasteland of the studio lot, and began walking directly toward my battered old Ford truck. I climbed out, bracing myself for more bad news or a demand to move my vehicle, but the man stopped and asked if I was Mr. Thomas Miller, formerly of Oak Creek. He introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, a senior partner at a high-end law firm downtown, and he handed me a heavy cream-colored envelope embossed with a gold seal I didn't recognize. Thorne explained that he had been searching for me for 3 days after Sarah had blocked his calls and told his office that I had passed away in a tragic car accident. My heart skipped a beat as he told me that Sarah had spent the last 5 years intercepting legal documents meant specifically for my eyes, documents regarding a massive estate in Western Virginia. It turned out that my biological father, a man I had never known, was a wealthy land developer named Arthur Sterling, who had spent his final years searching for the son he lost. Arthur had left a detailed will that named me as the sole heir to a vast portfolio of properties and a trust fund valued at over $12 million in liquid assets alone. Sarah had discovered this truth through a stray letter 5 years ago and had been systematically hiding the correspondence while she waited for me to naturally pass away from my health issues. She knew that if I died without knowing about the inheritance, she would likely be able to claim a significant portion of it through her status as my legal wife and widow. Thorne looked at my disheveled appearance and the garbage bags in the back of my truck, his expression softening with a professional but genuine sympathy that I wasn't prepared to handle. He told me that his firm had finally bypassed Sarah's gatekeeping after a private investigator tracked my phone to this lot, and he was here to ensure I received my full legal rights. The lawyer handed me a check for $50,000 as an immediate advance from the estate, telling me that I would never have to sleep in a truck bed ever again. I looked at the check, the numbers swimming before my eyes, and I realized that the nightmare Sarah had created was about to become the catalyst for her own absolute destruction and ruin. We drove to a nearby diner, and as I drank my first hot cup of coffee in 24 hours, Thorne began laying out the legal strategy to reclaim what was mine. He explained that because Sarah had committed mail fraud and identity theft to hide the inheritance, her claim to any of my assets, including the house, was now legally nullified. My mind raced as I thought about the look on Leo's face when he realized that the grease monkey he despised was actually the gatekeeper to a fortune he would never touch. Thorne also revealed that the DNA test I took at the hospital had triggered a notification in a private database that Arthur Sterling had set up to find any living relatives. The very medical crisis that Sarah thought would break me was actually the key that unlocked the vault to a future she had tried so desperately to steal for her own gain. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle into my chest, replacing the despair with a sharp focus that I hadn't felt since my days as a young sergeant in the United States Army. I told Thorne that I wanted to move quickly and quietly, letting Sarah and Leo believe they had won while we quietly dismantled every single lie they had used to build their lives. We spent the morning signing documents that officially transferred the Sterling properties into a private trust that Sarah would never be able to access, even if she stayed married to me. As I walked out of the law office, I looked at the city skyline and realized that for the first time in 61 years, I was truly free of the heavy chains of deception. I picked up my phone and saw a mocking text from Leo asking if I enjoyed the cold, and I simply smiled, knowing that his world was about to come crashing down. I spent that afternoon in a high-rise office overlooking the Monongahela River, watching Thorne's team of paralegals pull decades of tax returns and property records to build our case against Sarah's systemic fraud. Every document we unearthed told a story of calculated greed, showing how Sarah had been siphoning money from our joint accounts into a private offshore fund I never even knew existed until now. It was heartbreaking to see the cold, hard numbers on the page, proving that my wife had been planning her exit strategy for nearly a decade while I was working double shifts. Marcus Thorne explained that Sarah's biggest mistake was thinking I would never find out about Arthur Sterling's estate, which had been generating massive interest in a trust specifically designated for his only heir. We discovered that Sarah had even forged my signature on several federal documents to ensure the inheritance notices were rerouted to a private P.O. box she kept hidden in the next county over. While they gathered the evidence, I checked into a quiet suite at the Fairmont, finally sleeping in a bed that didn't smell like motor oil or feel like a betrayal waiting to happen. The next morning, Thorne took me to see a top-rated nephrologist who assured me that with my new financial resources, we could fast-track a private donor search and get me the best care. It was a strange sensation to realize that the money I never asked for was now the only thing standing between me and a slow death in a crowded public hospital ward. I sat in the doctor's waiting room, thinking about how Sarah would have let me waste away while she spent my father's fortune on designer shoes and luxury vacations with her secret son. Thorne called me later that afternoon with news that Sarah had already listed the Oak Creek house for sale, clearly trying to liquidate the asset before I could mount any legal defense. She had no idea that we had already filed a lease pendens against the property, effectively freezing the title and preventing any potential buyers from completing a transaction on the stolen family home. I felt a grim satisfaction, knowing that her plan to flip the house and run was already hitting a brick wall she never saw coming in her arrogance and her absolute greed. My brother David wept when I visited him in the hospital, telling him that I had finally found a way to pay for his entire treatment and move him to a better facility. I didn't tell him the whole story yet, just that our luck had finally changed and that he didn't have to worry about the mounting medical bills that had been crushing his spirit. Seeing the hope return to my brother's eyes gave me more strength than any bank account balance ever could, reminding me why I had worked so hard for all those difficult years. Meanwhile, Thorne's investigators were tracking down Sarah's former college flame, the man who was Leo's biological father, only to discover that he was a disgraced lawyer living in a trailer park. It was the ultimate irony that Sarah had traded a loyal, hard-working husband for a man who had ended up with nothing but a drinking habit and a string of failed professional dreams. I wondered if Leo knew the truth about his biological father's current state, or if Sarah was still feeding him lies about the man's supposed success in the high-stakes New York legal world. I decided to wait for the perfect moment to reveal that truth, wanting to see the look on Leo's face when he realized his grand illusions were built on a foundation of shifting sand. Thorne handed me a folder containing photographs of Arthur Sterling, the man who had looked for me for years, and I saw my own eyes staring back at me from his weathered face. He had been a visionary in West Virginia, building communities and providing jobs for thousands of people. Yet he had died alone because Sarah kept us apart to secure her own twisted future. I felt a deep sense of grief for the relationship I never had the chance to experience, a bond that had been stolen from both of us by a woman's cold-blooded financial calculations. My lawyer suggested we serve the first set of papers while Sarah was hosting one of her pretentious neighborhood brunch parties, ensuring the humiliation was as public as the betrayal had been. I agreed, realizing that the only language Sarah truly understood was the loss of social status and the public stripping away of the refined image she had worked so hard to project. On Saturday morning, 2 process servers arrived at the Oak Creek house just as the first guests were pulling into the driveway in their expensive European SUVs and luxury crossover vehicles. Sarah was dressed in a silk wrap dress, holding a tray of mimosas, when she was handed the summons and a notice that all her credit cards had been officially flagged for fraud. One of the guests, a woman who had always looked down on me as the help, watched in stunned silence as Sarah's face turned a ghostly shade of white in the morning sun. The process server loudly announced that the property was under legal dispute and that the owner was being investigated for multiple counts of mail fraud and systemic financial elder abuse against her husband. Leo came rushing out of the house, shouting threats and trying to intimidate the servers, but they simply handed him his own set of papers regarding his complicity in the grand deception. He stood there in his designer athletic wear, looking small and powerless as his wealthy friends whispered and began to quickly retreat to their cars to avoid the unfolding social scandal. I watched from a parked car down the street, my heart cold as stone, as Sarah dropped the tray of drinks and the glass shattered against the expensive Italian marble of the entryway. She looked around frantically for someone to help her, but the world she had built on a foundation of lies was already starting to evaporate into the humid Pennsylvania morning air. My phone buzzed with a frantic call from her, but I simply let it go to voicemail, having absolutely nothing left to say to the woman who had discarded me like trash. Her message was a chaotic mix of screams and fake apologies, begging me to call off the lawyers and promising that we could work everything out if I just came back home. I deleted the message without listening to the end, knowing that every word out of her mouth was just another desperate attempt to manipulate a man she thought was still a fool. Leo's follow-up text was even worse, filled with profanity and a demand for money, proving that he still hadn't grasped the reality that the bank had finally run dry for him. He threatened to go to the press with a story about me being an abusive father, not realizing that Thorne had already prepared a preemptive media strategy to protect my hard-earned reputation. We had 30 years of character witnesses from the auto shop and the freight yards who were more than willing to testify to my integrity and my constant sacrifice for my family. As the days passed, the legal pressure mounted, and Sarah found herself unable to pay the electricity bill or keep the water running because I had severed all the financial lifelines. She tried to sell her jewelry to a local pawn shop, only to find out that Thorne had placed a freeze on all high-value assets belonging to the marital estate pending the final audit. She was trapped in $1 million prison of her own making, surrounded by luxury items she could no longer afford to maintain or even keep in the house I had paid for. I moved into a modest but comfortable apartment near the hospital where David was staying, focusing my energy on his recovery and my own upcoming medical procedures with the new specialists. The quiet was a blessing after the years of Sarah's constant demands and Leo's entitled attitude, allowing me to finally process the magnitude of the change that had occurred in my life. Thorne visited me with a new set of documents from West Virginia, detailing the massive land holdings that were now legally mine to manage or sell as I saw fit for my future. One of the properties was a beautiful mountain cabin overlooking a valley, a place Arthur Sterling had built specifically for the son he hoped would one day find his way back home. I looked at the photos of the hand-hewn logs and the stone fireplace, feeling a strange sense of belonging that I had never felt in the sterile, suburban perfection of Oak Creek. I started planning a trip to the estate, wanting to see the life my father had lived and the legacy he had tried so hard to leave for me before he passed away alone. Meanwhile, Sarah's lawyer contacted Thorne with a desperate settlement offer, suggesting that she would walk away quietly if I gave her half of the Sterling inheritance and the Oak Creek house. I laughed out loud when I read the proposal, amazed that she still believed she had any leverage in a situation where she was facing potential prison time for her elaborate mail fraud. We countered with an offer of $0 and a demand that she vacate the house within 48 hours or face an immediate forceful eviction by the local sheriff's department and deputies. I also demanded that she sign a full confession regarding the DNA deception and the theft of the inheritance notices, which would be used to clear my name in any future disputes. She refused at first, clinging to the last shreds of her dignity, but the reality of her situation became undeniable when the bank started the foreclosure process on her other private debts. Leo tried to contact his real father in New York, hoping for a rescue, but the man didn't even remember Sarah's name and blocked Leo's number after the very first awkward phone call. The boy, who had looked down on a master mechanic, was now realizing that the successful life he thought he was entitled to was nothing more than a ghost story told by Sarah. He showed up at my new apartment one evening, looking disheveled and desperate, begging me for just $5,000 to get a place of his own before the house was seized. I stood in the doorway, looking at the young man I had raised, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, distant pity for his utter weakness. I told him that he should ask his real father for the money. Then I slowly closed the door on his pleading face, finally ending the cycle of my own blind, unrequited devotion. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most necessary, a final act of self-preservation for a man who had given everything to people who valued nothing. The following Monday, the sheriff arrived at the Oak Creek house to execute the eviction order, and I watched from the sidewalk as Sarah was escorted out in her pajamas and slippers. She screamed and cursed at me as the movers began piling her expensive furniture on the lawn, but her words no longer had the power to hurt or even reach my heart. Neighbors I had known for years stood on their porches, watching the downfall of the woman who had always pretended to be the queen of their small, exclusive suburban social circle. Leo was nowhere to be found, having apparently packed his bags and vanished into the night as soon as he realized that the money was truly gone and I wasn't backing down. I walked through the empty rooms of the house one last time, remembering the sweat and the long hours it took to pay for each and every one of these cold, silent walls. I didn't feel sadness, only a profound sense of relief that the weight of the lies had finally been lifted, and the truth was finally allowed to breathe in the open air. I handed the keys to the real estate agent, instructing her to sell the property immediately and donate every single penny of the profit to a local vocational school for young mechanics. I wanted that money to build something real, to help young men like I used to be, rather than funding the hollow lifestyles of people who didn't understand the value of honest labor. Thorne met me in the driveway, looking pleased with the outcome, and told me that the district attorney was officially moving forward with the mail fraud charges against my former wife. Sarah would likely spend the next several years in a state facility, a far cry from the Mediterranean cruises and luxury boutiques she had envisioned for her golden years of stolen wealth. I drove toward the hospital to pick up David, who had finally been cleared for a more intensive treatment program at a specialized clinic in the mountains near my new estate. We crossed the state line into West Virginia as the leaves were starting to turn, the vibrant oranges and deep reds of the Appalachian autumn welcoming me to a brand new life. The road wound upward through the misty valleys, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I was a small child before the foster system took my innocence. When we reached the gates of the Sterling estate, a local man named Henry was waiting for me, having worked for my father for over 40 years as the head of maintenance. He shook my hand with a firm, honest grip and told me that Arthur had never stopped talking about me, even when the letters he sent kept coming back, marked as undeliverable. I realized then that I hadn't just inherited a fortune. I had inherited a history and a father who had loved me from afar, despite the walls Sarah had built to keep us. I stood on the porch of the mountain cabin and looked out over the vast, beautiful wilderness that was now my responsibility to protect and preserve for the generations to come. The morning air in the Appalachian Mountains felt crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the thick, oily smog of the Pittsburgh freight yards that had filled my lungs for 30 years. I walked through the halls of my father's manor, touching the mahogany railings and realizing that this was the home I was always meant to inherit before Sarah's greed intervened so cruelly. Henry, the estate manager, handed me a leather-bound journal that Arthur had kept during his final years, filled with entries about the son he hoped was living a happy and successful life. Reading my father's words brought a lump to my throat as I realized he had been thinking of me every single day, while I was being manipulated by the woman I trusted. Marcus Thorne called from the city to inform me that the grand jury had officially handed down indictments against Sarah for multiple counts of aggravated mail fraud and felony identity theft charges. She was currently being held on a high bond because the prosecutor considered her a flight risk after they discovered she had been looking at one-way flights to a non-extradition country. It was a pathetic end for a woman who had once prided herself on being the most sophisticated and respected member of our suburban social circle in the hills of Oak Creek. My focus shifted back to my brother David, who was finally responding well to the new treatments at the private clinic, his strength returning as the weight of debt was finally lifted. We found a match for my kidney transplant through a private donor network, a young man whose life I was able to transform in return with a generous educational trust fund gift. The surgery took place in a state-of-the-art facility in Charleston, and as I went under anesthesia, I felt a strange sense of peace I hadn't known in 3 long, painful decades. Recovery was slow but steady, and during those quiet weeks in the hospital, I had plenty of time to reflect on the man I was and the man I wanted to become now. Leo tried to send me an email through a burner account, claiming he was homeless and begging for a second chance, but I simply forwarded the message to Thorne's legal investigation team. I knew that any contact with him would only lead back to the cycle of entitlement and disrespect that had poisoned my life for 25 years of false fatherhood and constant sacrifice. He had chosen his side the moment he mocked my hard work, and now he had to face the consequences of relying on a mother who had built their world on lies. Once I was back on my feet at the estate, I started the Sterling Foundation to provide scholarships for children in the foster care system who were aging out without any support. I wanted to ensure that no child had to endure the loneliness and fear that I felt when I was tossed out into the world with nothing but a pair of work boots. The local community in West Virginia welcomed me with open arms, seeing me not as a wealthy stranger, but as the son of a man they had respected for many long years. I spent my afternoons in the old workshop on the property, restoring vintage cars and teaching local teenagers the trade that had sustained me through my darkest and most difficult times. There was a profound dignity in working with my hands again, but this time the labor was for my own satisfaction and the benefit of the community rather than Sarah's bottomless greed. Thorne arrived at the estate one rainy Tuesday with the final divorce decree and a report on Sarah's sentencing hearing that had taken place in the Pittsburgh County Courthouse that morning. Sarah was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary with a mandate to pay full restitution from any future earnings or assets she might somehow acquire during her lifetime of shame. The house in Oak Creek had sold for a record price, and the funds were already being distributed to the vocational school exactly as I had instructed during our very first meeting. I felt a final chord snap inside me, releasing the last bit of bitterness I held toward the woman who had stolen 30 years of my life for a temporary, hollow dream. David moved into a cottage on the estate grounds, his health fully restored, and we spent our evenings on the porch talking about the parents we barely remembered from our childhood years. We were the last of our line, but we were finally living with the truth, and there was a quiet power in knowing that our father had actually wanted us after all. I received a letter from a former neighbor in Pittsburgh telling me that Leo was seen working a grueling entry-level job at a local warehouse, struggling to make his monthly rent payments. It was the kind of honest labor he had always mocked, and I hoped that the experience would eventually teach him the humility and respect he had lacked for so many arrogant years. I didn't take pleasure in his struggle, but I knew it was the only way he would ever understand the value of $1 or the weight of a father's silent daily sacrifice. My health continued to improve as I hiked the trails Arthur had blazed through the mountains, feeling his presence in every rustling leaf and every clear stream that flowed through our land. I discovered a hidden room in the basement of the manor that contained boxes of old photographs and letters from my mother, proving that their separation was never my father's choice at all. It seemed that Sarah wasn't the first person to use deception to tear our family apart, but I was determined to be the last one to let the lies win the day. I decided to open the Sterling estate to the public once a month, hosting events that celebrated local history and provided a space for families to gather and build lasting, honest memories. The sight of children running across the lawn brought a new kind of life to the old house, filling the empty rooms with a warmth that had been missing for far too long. I hired Henry's grandson to help me manage the foundation, seeing in him the same drive and integrity that had once defined my own youth before the world tried to break me down. Life in the mountains had a different rhythm, one that allowed for reflection and growth, far away from the constant noise and the bitter competition of the suburban life I had escaped. Thorne visited one last time to wrap up the remaining legal details of the Sterling Trust, telling me that I was one of the few clients who had handled wealth with grace. I told him that after 30 years of having nothing but my pride and my toolbox, I knew exactly what was worth keeping and what was simply a distraction from a meaningful life. I made a final trip back to Pittsburgh to visit the grave of my former mentor at the auto body shop, the man who had taught me everything I knew about honest work. I stood there in my suit, feeling like a stranger in the city that had once been my whole world, realizing that I had finally outgrown the smallness of my previous, narrow existence. As I drove back toward West Virginia, I passed the exit for Oak Creek and didn't even feel the urge to look toward the neighborhood where I had once been so deeply unhappy. The man who lived in that house was a ghost, a hard-working fool who had been blinded by a love that was never returned, and I was glad to leave him behind forever. I reached the summit of the mountain pass just as the sun was setting, the entire valley bathed in a golden light that seemed to promise a future full of peace and purpose. I realized that my father's real gift wasn't the money or the land, but the chance to start over and build a life that was based on truth rather than a convenient, comfortable lie. David met me at the front door of the manor, a smile on his face as he showed me the new garden he had started in the courtyard behind the main house gallery. We sat on the back deck, watching the fireflies dance in the tall grass, and I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this very moment. I started writing my own journal, documenting the truth of my life, so that if I ever had real grandchildren, they would know the story of the man who refused to stay broken. The Sterling name would mean something different now, something associated with resilience, honesty, and a commitment to helping those who had been discarded by the people they thought they could trust implicitly. I received a final letter from Sarah's lawyer, begging for a character reference to help with her early release, but I simply threw it into the fireplace without even bothering to reply at all. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness, and I had learned that my silence was the most powerful response to a woman who had spent her life weaponizing words to hurt others cruelly. I looked at my hands, now clean and soft but still strong, and realized that they were finally being used to build a legacy that would actually last long after I was gone from here. The foundation was growing rapidly, and we were already seeing the first group of scholarship recipients graduate and start their own lives with the support I had never had as a young man. I took David to the local diner in town, where everyone knew our names and treated us with a simple, honest kindness that had been missing from our lives for so many decades. We were just two brothers enjoying a meal together, no longer defined by our struggles or the people who had tried to destroy us for their own selfish and short-sighted financial gain. I spent the weekend clearing out the remaining boxes in the attic, finding a small wooden carving of a truck that Arthur had made for me when I was just a small baby. He had never stopped loving me. And that realization was the final piece of the puzzle that allowed me to finally let go of the pain and move forward into the light completely. I began to travel, visiting the places Arthur had written about in his journals, seeing the world through his eyes, and feeling a connection to a man I had never actually met in person. Every new experience was a victory over the small, restricted life Sarah had tried to force me into, a way to reclaim the years I had lost to her manipulation and her greed. I returned to the estate with a renewed sense of energy, ready to take on the next chapter of my life with a clear head and a heart that was finally at peace. The winter came, covering the mountains in a blanket of white, and I sat by the fireplace with David, feeling warm and secure in the home that was truly and legally our own. I thought about the cold nights in the back of my truck and realized that the hardship had only made this comfort feel more earned and more precious than it ever could have. I was no longer the victim of a 30-year lie, but the author of a new story, one that would be defined by the truth and the strength I found in myself alone. The foundation received a large donation from an anonymous source, and I realized that Arthur had friends all over the country who were still looking out for his legacy and for his son. I felt a deep responsibility to use these resources wisely, ensuring that every dollar went toward making a real difference in the lives of people who had been forgotten by the world around them. David started a community garden project, teaching local families how to grow their own food and build a sense of self-sufficiency that would serve them well for the rest of their lives. We were building something beautiful in the shadows of the mountains, a place of healing and hope for anyone who had ever felt the sting of betrayal or the weight of a secret. I looked out the window at the snow falling softly on the trees, feeling a sense of contentment that I never thought was possible for a man like me after everything I had survived. My name is Thomas Miller, and while I may have been a fool for 30 years, I finally learned that the truth is the only thing that can truly set a man free. I don't look back at the grease and the grime with regret anymore, because those years of hard work gave me the character I needed to handle the fortune I eventually found waiting. Sarah and Leo are part of a past that no longer has any power over me, their lies having been burned away by the heat of a justice they never expected to face. I have a brother who loves me, a father who searched for me, and a community that respects the man I have become through the fire of the most devastating family betrayal. I spend my mornings on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the land that will one day belong to the children I help through the Sterling Foundation and my work. There is a legacy here that goes far beyond money or property, a legacy of resilience that will continue to grow long after my own story has reached its final and peaceful conclusion. I am 61 years old, and my life is just beginning, a life built on the solid rock of the truth rather than the shifting sands of a woman's cold and heartless deception. I closed my journal and set it on the table, knowing that the man I used to be would be proud of the man I had finally found the courage to become today. The mountain air was cold, but my heart was finally warm, and as I walked back inside my home, I knew that the 30-year lie was finally and forever over for good.